Welcome to the chapter on using your new Facetron. This chapter is in 3 parts. First, the accessories and other stuff people are going to try to sell you. Second, a short list of serious no-nos, things to avoid doing for sure. Third, there's some basic standard procedures of using the machine. This chapter is not a lesson on how to fasten. That subject is much more complicated and much more lengthy than we could cover in a few minutes of video. So this chapter of this DVD is about, first, accessories. And my first comment about accessories is do not buy aftermarket DOPs. They won't fit, there's tolerance problems, they're going to cause you transfer problems and no end of headaches. They absolutely are not worth any few bucks that you might save. Don't buy aftermarket DOPs, just buy the factory ones. Another thing is gadgets and gizmos. Quill holders and dopping gadgets to try to hold stones and dop them, presumably with greater accuracy than your eye. This just isn't the case. You can't gadget your way past actual skill. And skill is just practice. So practice with fastening is fun. Have fun. Practice a lot. Build a skill. Don't try to gadget your way past it. One of the things people will try to sell you is splash pan windows or little slidey gadgets to cover the hole that some people cut in their splash pan. If you don't damage the splash pan in the first place, you won't need a slidey little window to try to plug the hole where the water is splashing through. So I don't recommend any of those things, obviously, at all. I find it all extraneous, and I find it all is pretty much a waste of money. Some of it causes problems, and much of it is based on this thing of trying to gadget your way past skills. Just have fun, build your experience, build your skill with fun. There are some accessories that I do recommend, including which cutting and polishing laps to use and what basic tools that you need in your toolkit. Now this list changes periodically, and I keep both printed and video versions of my latest suggestions available on my website at fasteningacademy.com. If you go to fasteningacademy.com, you can download the newest version of recommended tools, recommended laps, and again, I don't recommend a lot of gadgets, but there are a few things that actually do save time and trouble, and I will recommend those. So you can see the video, you can download the document on the website. For my latest recommendations, including some articles on how to use those gadgets, check out the website as well. So now for the section of this video on no-nos in working with a Facetron machine. The first one of those things is never adjust the head with one hand. I had a friend who once said only John Wayne did it with one hand and he's not around anymore. So always use both hands when moving the head or touching the head locking lever. Whenever you bump this loose, the head is going to be free and it can free fall. If the quill is in a downward position with a dop and a stone, you can gouge the base plate, break the stone, bend the dop, take a chunk out of one of your expensive laps. And the reason I know these things is because I did them at the beginning when I was learning to use this machine. So I recommend training yourself. Never move the head without both hands and one hand under the head. Usually, of course, this is the way that the head will normally face. I always use my left hand and I always support the quill so that even if I'm at a very low angle, I'm always supporting the quill. So if anything does slip, always the stone will wind up upward and never have a chance to bash into the lap, knock the stone off, or bend the dop. I just eliminate that possibility by the way I use this left hand right here. Simple ergonomics. Always as the head goes down, the quill goes up. And then I adjust it, the angle, carefully after I've moved the head. Another big tip in head handling, use your rubber band safety. And I covered this in the last chapter, how to put one of these together. This saves a lot of grief because it's just a little safety against bumping the head. Another never to do is storing the quill in this upright position. Never park your quill this way. If there's a dop in the machine with a stone on it and we try to park it this way, the stone is going to hit either against the micrometer or against the mast itself. If you lose control of this and let it bump a little bit, you can chip the stone. The stone is also going to have swarf on it from being ground. It may have diamond polish on it, or pre-polish. You may have 3,000 or even 2,000 grit diamond on that stone. If you allow it to touch your micrometer, then the next time you go to adjust your height adjustment, you're going to contaminate your fingers with the diamond. If the head of the machine is lower and you're touching the mast itself, you'll contaminate the mast with abrasive, which will then get in between the mast and the head, and it's going to wear your machine down faster. Also, if this is a habit, as you go from a more coarse grind to a finer grind or to a polish, you wind up with swarf particles here from a 600 cutting. They'll wind up on the stone when you're trying to do polishing, and then you're going to wonder where your scratches came from. So this is just a way to create contamination on your stone and also to chip the girdles of stones by striking them against the mast. This will also cause the swarf and grindings and other detritus on the stone, the water that's contaminated with abrasives, cause them to run down inside your quill. They'll eventually concrete the inside of that quill, pack it up. It'll be dirty inside there. It'll cause repeatability problems, accuracy problems, and gum up the quill. You might notice that even though I use this machine all the time, that the quill just spins nice and freely like this when it's in freewheeling. So there's no gum inside my machine. I never park it this way. Always park it quill down. Always park it quill down. That way any water runs off. Just park it to one side or another of the lap and you won't hit anything. Also keeps it from swinging around. If you have it up here, it's easy for something, the cat or some other person, to bump this, not realizing that it's going to fly down like that. And if that happens to happen over your lap, you're going to wind up with broken stone, lost stone, gouged lap. So this is a recipe for that happening. You don't want that. Another thing is to remember, the Facetron has a reversible motor on it. It can travel clockwise or counterclockwise, which is really useful in some of your polishing operations, especially with stones with cleavages. Never reverse the direction of the lap while the machine is running. That can be really difficult for the motor or the controller, and you wind up, motors are pretty expensive and so are controllers. So if you're going to reverse directions of the lap, there's two ways to do that. One is to take the stone that you're cutting and simply go from working the front side of the lap to the back side of the lap. That automatically will change the direction of stroke of the lap across the stone. Just go to the back side of the lap. Another way to do that is to turn off the motor. Turn it all the way off, let it come to a full stop. Then hit the direction change on the switch. Then spin it back up. Another thing not to do is to try to move the cheater while the freewheeling lock is engaged. If I lock this little button so we're locked into freewheeling, that locks this lever in place because this button is now pressing against part of the head. If I try to move the cheater, which will try to force this lever side to side, it's going to drag that little bolt where it's making a tight bearing against that surface in there. It's going to scratch and scrape. It may bend the bolt. It's not good for the machine at all. So always make sure that this button is completely loose when you're running the cheater. Remember that your stones are wet. The machine is wet. There's splash all over the place. And although you might not see or even feel that any of the water anywhere on the machine has abrasive in it, it does. Any water on this machine, if it didn't come directly from the tank, only directly out of here, if it didn't come directly from there, every other splatter of water on the machine has abrasives in it. You don't want to get it in your eye. You don't want to touch things like the mast or any other bearing surface, handling the back side of your dops that are going to go into the quill. You don't want to touch any part of the machine that's going to need to function where abrasives would be bad. Always clean, keep your hands clean and dry in between handling those parts of the machine. Lots of people will use different types of polishing laps where they use spray type diamond to spray and charge the lap. I personally don't use those techniques, but a lot of people use them. They seem to be pretty popular. Remember that all of that spray, including the overspray, is going to contain diamond. You don't want diamond worked into the surface of your aluminum base plate. It's going to grind the base plate. It's going to grind the bottom of your mast. Everything that diamond touches is going to become abrasive. Your your lap retaining nut will get diamond on it. So wash these things, especially if you're using diamond. Wash them. Clean everything. Clean it very aggressively with a bristle brush and some soap, and get the diamond off of there. So now we're to the part of standard operating procedures. Always use both hands whenever you adjust or touch the locking lever. Always use both hands whenever you're going to move the head. I think I've said this a few times. I'll say it again. Always use two hands whenever you move the head, and using two hands will save you 2 handfuls of cash. So just remember that and train yourself to always do it. It's a good idea to test the Quill's grab on the dop whenever you're putting a dop into the machine. Get in the habit of just, once you lock the dop in place, always test it to make sure there's a good grab. If you do this, you'll never have the thing shifting around on you. One of my suggestions also is always use filtered water for your cutting, and particularly your pre-polishing and any type of polishing where you're using drip water. I have a nice water filter on my system at the shop, and all the water that comes in, it goes through that filter. Never use unfiltered water in here. You get old pipes in an older house, and there's pipe plaque in there, or if the city is working on the pipe somewhere 2 blocks away from your house, the city can be working on the plumbing, and they'll break loose a bunch of that pipe plaque, and you'll have little hard pieces of concreted iron will come flowing down through the pipes, and the next thing you know, they're going to be in your polish water. So I recommend, as a standard procedure, always use filtered water. Make sure your index gear locking thumb screw, this one, make sure it isn't creeping in as you're constantly pressing this lever to come to new indexes on the machine. Sometimes this little thumb screw will find its way part of the way in. The way you constantly check this is to constantly turn the quill back and forth. Just a slight little turn. You're going to be handling the stone with this left hand anyway, if you're doing proper ergonomics. If you constantly move this back and forth, you can hear that little ticking is a little play. So you'll feel it and you'll hear it, and you can back this screw out. Now there's no play, there's no ticking. That'll prevent you from having all kinds of crazy repeatability stuff in your rotational positioning of your stone. This is like, Jeff Jarvie likens this to checking the safety of your rifle if you're walking around hunting. Always just putting your finger on that safety. I always just test the rotation, make sure my dop is still locked in tight, and check the rotation. I always handle a stone, handle the head always with 2 hands. I mentioned that when we're changing the elevation of the head. I also do it as I'm cutting. I actually use 2 hands, my fingers on the stone, and my other hand controlling the index locking lever with fingers above and below the quill. So I can control the quill completely up and down with this hand, and then I add additional control here. This keeps my body in an even position. A lot of people will try to reach over the top and be really ham-handed with this, with the elbow up in the air. This is going to cause all kinds of back problems, neck aches from this twisted position. You get shoulder pain, neck pain, and back pain from this. The ergonomics of this are terrible, and you can't sit and cut for a very long period of time. It's cramping, and it's just very unpleasant. If you turn this hand almost palm up and bring it directly into the machine like this, I'll use these fingers, usually these fingers. This allows me to just close my hand gently, and that releases the index gear for rotating while maintaining a complete control on the head and the up and down motion of the quill while I rotate the stone with this hand. This allows me to always check, make sure I'm seated correctly in my index, and make sure that there's no play. So this set of ergonomics keeps my shoulders even. This keeps my shoulders even, keeps my spine straight up and down. I don't have any leaning or tilting, no cramping in my neck or my shoulders and my back. I can cut like this with two hands all day long, changing indexes very quickly just by squeezing my fingers together. You may find some variations of this. Whatever you do, I recommend that you be careful to keep both elbows down and your spine straight, and make a habit of always handling your stone and your head with two hands. This protects the stone. I never have problems with it banging into things because I'm always protecting it. It's called a precious stone for a reason. I protect it from knocking into things. Another great suggestion I got from Jeff Jarvie is use water treatment to soften the water in your drip tank. If you live in the boonies somewhere and you have well water, in addition to the filter to take out the little particles, also use water softener, because hard water tends to attack the anodizing on your base plate, and that's not particularly good. So water softener treatment's a good idea. When you're cutting and you're watching the stop needle, that needle is going to be bouncing. There aren't any laps that are really particularly perfect out there. So whatever angle you're cutting at, the lap surface is going to be imperfect, and you're going to get a little bounce in your needle. It's going to be less bounce than I'm doing here, but you're going to have a bounce. As the needle bounces and pulses, whether you're always stopping when the top of the bounce reaches your zero, or the bottom of your bounce is at zero, or whether the bounce is perfectly straddling your zero in equal distances on either side. If you always stop with the bounce the same, always stop with it at the top, or always stop with it at the bottom, or always stop with it in a straddle, just stop with it behaving the same every time, and then you'll have consistency. You also want to stop in the same place on the lap, because while the lap may have some wobble in it from one side to the other, they also tend to have a little bit of run out from the center out to the outside. So always stop on the same location on the lap. Same location on the lap, same location on the needle, and you're going to have the same depth of cut. Remember one more time, all of the water on the machine, it's all contaminated. When it gets on your hands, whatever your hands touch is going to be contaminated with abrasive. So clean the hands constantly, dry the hands constantly, and clean the machine after every single stone. That means clean the base plate, including especially underneath the splash pan. The splash pan is this rubber-like material. It's impervious to water. That's what makes it useful. It's against this aluminum, and water will creep under here by capillary action. So always take the splash pan off. You don't have to take everything loose. Just pull the splash pan up like this. Use some sort of paper towel or abrasive. Mop under here really well. Make sure this is dry. And then leave the splash pan either tilted or take it completely off the machine, so there's no surface here to trap water against the base plate. Water trapped against the base plate will make hard water pits and marks, and it'll eat away at the anodizing, make your machine look ugly. It's important to periodically clean the index gear itself, because the index gear locking lever has a tooth on the back of it that catches teeth on the gear. Sometimes the teeth on the gear get swarf and dust and other crap gets stuck in there, and that can be enough to push the locking tooth a little bit to the side, rotates the quill a little bit, and you'll get crazy kind of mixed meats where some facets are off to the left and some facets are off to the right. When I had this first time this happened to me, it drove me really bananas, because I was trying to make really perfect meats, and some were off one way, some were off the other way. There's no way to cheat that in. And I thought maybe my dop was slipping inside the quill. I thought maybe the index gear had come loose, because sometimes that can happen. You want to always make sure your index gear is nice and snug. And none of those things were true. Eventually I took the machine apart, took the index gear off, and looked at it, and it had a little junk in there. So you can actually see the index gear teeth by standing the quill upside down. These are the teeth right here. You can examine these at this location, and if they've got splatters and junk in them, you're going to wind up taking your index gear off, and just take a toothbrush and some Lime Away or some Formula 409 or something, and just clean them out. As soon as they're cleaned out, the problems go away. There's an important thing to know about a concept in machining called a setup cut and production cut. A setup cut means we cut a little bit and look to see if we have our depth. And we cut a little bit more and see if we have our depth. So we're going to use our micrometer adjustment, lower the head down by tiny increments, cut a little bit, and see if the meats are where we want them yet. Once we reach our depth, we've achieved that depth in this particular facet by repeatedly cutting just a little bit. And there's a certain amount of resistance as you're cutting. So then when you go to another facet on the same depth of cut, same angle, same row of facets, when you go to another facet and you're taking off a lot more of the stone, it may seem to resist more or less, and you may push on it harder or something. But the next set of cuts, because you're cutting a lot more material, tend to fall at a different depth, either more shallow or more deep. So that's the difference between a setup cut and a production cut. Always make your setup cuts very careful, and always check the first as you begin to do your production cuts, and make sure that you're not overcutting past that setup cut. Another thing that happens is anything with threads on it, when you reverse directions on the threads, in order for threads to function, there has to be a certain amount of space between them. If you had zero space in your threads, you'd have a solid piece of metal, not a thread. So if you can take any nut on any bolt and wiggle the nut, and you'll feel the nut have a little bit of play. That's the amount of play between the inside threads and the outside threads. That's a normal thing in machining, and although high precision machinery has a very small amount of play, there's still some play there, and we're talking about very, very high precision machinery here. So anytime you change angles, and when you change angles with the digital protractor, you're turning something. This is a bolt that goes inside of here, and there's threads on it. So anytime I change the angle, I'm coming to a different location on the threads. Once I do that, there's lubrication in between there, there's space, especially if you reverse direction, you're changing, putting space in there. So when you go and put this thing down, you're pressing some of the lubricant out from between the threads. Every time you push it down, you're pressing some lubricant out. So the first several times you do that, the nut is settling into place, even though you're getting an indication on your dial indicator. The nut is settling further into place. So the first several times, the actual depth of cut will shift a little bit, usually down. So it's good to be aware of that. One of the ways to mitigate that, I do this myself, is whenever I change depth, I just pick the quill up and set it down. You can hear it making contact inside very gently. I don't slam it, I don't hit it hard, I don't drop the quill. I just touch it several times. Maybe half a dozen times, something like that. That takes out a lot of it. It's called backlash. In machinist speak, it's backlash. So I'm taking some of the backlash out of the system. Then I check the depth, and I check the backlash a few more times and make sure it hasn't changed. Once I do this a few times and find no change when the stone touches the lap, I know the backlash is out of the system, and I'm going to have a consistent cut. Remember one more time, at the front of this mast, the little dark area under our bib, in case you either forgot or didn't watch the other part of the video. Remember this area right here tends to collect grit if it's not protected somehow, and that grit will cause wear, and that wear will cause problems. So protect that part of your mast. I like to use a bib and a napkin both. I'm a little sloppy that way. This covers the main operating suggestions for the Facetron. If there's something that you think is standard but doesn't seem to be covered here, please let me know and I'll add it to the next version of this DVD. In the meantime, for more information and training on faceting, including the latest suggestions for accessories, the latest designs, and other stuff, visit me online at facetingacademy.com, where I'll personally answer all of your questions on my blog. The next